Hi, welcome to our final review for the second semester of Honors World History. Our goal today is for you to be able to walk away from class being able to explain how governments and societies built power, justified authority, faced challenges, and became unstable all the way throughout semester 2. So this is kind of our capstone, bringing the big story together lesson. So let's put it all together. The big story. What story did this semester tell? Well, first off, it told you a story that authority does not just last because people are forced to obey. Turns out forcing people to follow you isn't the most stable way to run a society. That's what history shows us. Governments and societies need legitimacy to stay stable. That is, the people must see it as worthy of having power over us. Different rulers have used different systems in order to create that legitimacy. We've seen belief used for it, law, identity like nationalism, and just sheer violence and power all shaped who ruled different societies throughout this entire semester and throughout world history. But we studied how these different forms of creating legitimacy, how they reacted when trade, labor, and technology accelerated change in society, and a lot of these systems could not keep pace, right? Crisis, moments of real uncertainty, exposed the weaknesses that were built into these systems and were building for a very long time. And we studied how each of these systems reacted to these crises and accelerated change within their societies. So going back to Unit 7, the very beginning of this semester, right, looking at the pre-Columbian cultures in the Americas, how did these civilizations build authority? After all, we looked in first semester how that authority was built in African, European, and Asian societies, but the pre-Columbian cultures had been separated from the rest of that world for thousands of years. So how did they establish authority over the people they ruled over? And the Maya, Inca, and Aztec all had real systems of power in place that helped them essentially keep control over massive populations. These rulers used religion, labor systems, tribute systems, and just general organization to maintain control over these populations, as we studied. And these systems could be very strong, right? We saw them, like the Aztec system, the Inca system, really having real strength to them, allowing them to build large and powerful empires. But we also saw the vulnerabilities built into them. It's important to understand the strengths of these systems, but also what made them vulnerable. A real example of this was the tribute system used by the Aztecs, right? It built a powerful empire for the Aztecs by forcing their neighboring societies to give them resources in exchange for, well, not being sacrificed to the Aztec god. The problem here is, while it did build wealth for the Central Empire, it built resentment among the people that they had conquered, and that weakens loyalty to the government, which could be exploited during a time of crisis. Infrastructure like roads, food distribution, things like this could really strengthen an empire by meeting the needs of the people in that empire, like we saw among the Inca. But those systems were very centralized. That is, the power came from the leader of the Inca, the emperor himself, and all came from their capital, Cusco. And these systems were very fragile in a time of crisis, right? If something happened to the leader or the elites in society who organized all of this, who were at the core of the centralized system, then the whole thing would fall apart and would no longer meet the needs of the people, and you'd have, well, the whole system would unravel. So again, we're seeing these strengths build up empires, but those strengths also have core weaknesses in them, structural vulnerabilities we've been calling them, that cause it to unravel when pressure hits it. And in the case of these pre-Columbian cultures, that pressure was the arrival of European civilizations. In Unit 8, we bounced back to Europe to see what was going on in Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire. We call this period the Middle Ages or the medieval period, and we looked at what happens when central authority collapsed, right? The Roman Empire weakened, collapsed in the Western Europe, right? In the East, it carries on as the Byzantine Empire, but in the West, it's kind of gone. And so local rulers gain a lot more power because there's no strong centralized control. This leads to the rise of the feudalism system, right? Feudalism grew where protection became valuable in a very dangerous world. There was no longer the Roman Empire and the Roman army protecting the people of Western Europe, so instead they had to kind of fend for themselves, and people traded their freedom for safety by promising their loyalty to local lords in exchange for protection. You'll remember at this time it's the Vikings arriving, the Magyars, the Saracens from Africa all coming in and creating this instability. And the Catholic Church also rose to become a powerful force at this time because it offered people stability, meaning, and legitimacy, a continuation of normalcy. It also promised them a reward in the afterlife if they just kind of did what the church said. So, just like we saw among the Aztec, the Maya, and the Inca, right, authority did rely on belief, but in the feudal system, it also relied on personal loyalty. The idea that I am personally loyal to the person above me in the social hierarchy because they protect me in a time of crisis. And these systems worked well for a time, about 800 years, but it also contains structural vulnerabilities that when crises hit or big changes happen, the systems have trouble adapting to, as we saw. We also saw in the medieval unit, in Unit 8, these societies started to weaken as trade and towns and population grew, and that slowly kind of weakened feudal obligations as people had other ways to make money or get protection other than pledging their loyalty to the people above them in the social hierarchy. The Crusades we studied challenged trust in religious leadership because the Pope was supposed to be speaking to God and said that the will of God that Christians go fight Muslims in the Middle East. But then we see the Christians lose these wars. And so people start to kind of not lose trust in Christianity, but lose trust in the religious leadership, right? These are the cracks that start forming. The plague also exposes these limits of existing explanations and authority because the church just could not explain why this was happening, right? People were searching, grasping for straws, trying to figure out why so many people were dying. And even religious leaders were dying of this plague, so people were starting to call those leaders into question, right? More cracks forming in the foundations of what had built stability in Europe during this period. And kings were increasingly finding other ways to create justification for their power, right? Legitimacy. They used laws and judges and national identity, this proto-nationalism, to strengthen rule, as we saw over happening in France and England, right? The French were like, no, we don't be ruled by an English king, we want to be ruled by a French king. And the kings of England were using judges to go out and enforce their laws all across the local regions instead of just leaving up to the local lords to handle, creating more strengthened centralized government. So these old systems of the medieval period didn't just disappear all at once. It's these weaknesses just became harder and harder to ignore, and the systems were forced to change and adapt or completely collapse if they didn't. Then in Unit 9, we saw authority being challenged with the Renaissance and the Reformation. Now, the Renaissance and Renaissance, people more normally associate this with art, and the Reformation with religion, but both were deeply tied to politics, the study of how to create laws and how to distribute power here on Earth. Now, humanism, which is really kind of at the core, the heart of the Renaissance movement, brought in who could define knowledge. Before the Renaissance, knowledge was defined by the Pope and the leaders of the Catholic Church. Humanism was saying, well, maybe there's another way to understand, what is true in the world by studying humans, by studying nature. And this was a challenge to the control of knowledge that the church depended on. The printing press also comes about during this time, weakening older control over information. As the ideas could be quickly printed and distributed, it made it much harder for the church to keep control of these things. The Reformation shattered a once unified source of religious authority because now instead of the Pope being the sole source of Christian authority in Western Europe, there's these different versions of Christianity, the Protestant versions, whether it's Lutheranism, Baptism, Anabaptism, Calvinism, Anglicanism, all these different ways to interpret Christianity popping up across Europe, which challenges the control of the Catholic Church over religious belief. And rulers were gaining opportunities to control religion more directly in their lands. You'll remember that in the medieval period, a lot of times what it was is the Catholic Church and the European kings, the Germanic kings and these warlords essentially, were kind of pairing up and teaming up. And it was the question of why do you get to be king? It's because God says so, prove it. The Pope says, yeah, I talked to God. God wants this guy being king. But kings then are kind of dependent on the popes for their legitimacy. The Reformation creates an opening for them to kind of pry that power away from the Pope and put it into their own hands by creating their own versions of Christianity that they get to interpret for the people of their lands. So we saw in Unit 9 Europe becoming much less unified and much more competitive as it was no longer just these kings competing against each other, but it was also religious belief systems competing against each other in Europe. It's also in Unit 9 we saw Europeans turning outward, no longer just satisfied with keeping to Europe. And we saw this happen for several reasons, right? Rulers wanted wealth, they wanted to control trade routes, and they wanted power, and large global empires with colonies gave them this. These states were in competition with each other, which to gain more wealth, more land, control over more trade routes, and this increased pressure for each of these kingdoms to kind of build larger and larger global empires. Hopefully, you remember the real driving point for this was that Europeans wanted access to eastern trade routes that went all the way to Italy and China. However, those trade routes were kind of ending right at the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans were trading with the merchants of the Italian peninsula, specifically Venice and a few other places, right? Which meant that Western Europeans, if they wanted access to these things, were paying a lot of marked up prices, right? They wanted cheaper access to it. So they're looking for other ways to get access to those trade routes. And so this led to Europeans trying to find other ways, whether it's south around Africa or west in order to get east like Columbus tried. But this expansion was tied to both economics, right, gaining of wealth and resources and trade routes, but also religion. Because remember, around this time, these different kingdoms are now following different versions of Christianity, trying to prove their version was the right one, because if they could get the largest empire with the control of the most trade routes, that would be seen as a sign of God's blessing, meaning their version of Christianity was the correct version in their minds. And this is also the time, because of these large empires and a lot of labor is needed in these colonies, we start to see the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, because it connects labor, profit, dehumanization, and empire building all into one in the Atlantic slave trade. So again, very dark period in human history. We then moved on to Unit 10, new ideas about legitimacy, right? What made old political authority less secure? Absolutism was this idea that these rulers were claiming they had the right to hold concentrated power. That is, absolute monarchs believed they could control every aspect of your life. They couldn't be challenged by anyone, not the Pope, not, the local lords, not the common people. This is kind of tied up in the idea of the divine right of kings. The idea that, why are you king? It's because, well, if God didn't want me being king, then I wouldn't be king. Therefore, the fact that I am king means it's what God wants and you should follow me. This is the idea of absolutism, which then becomes challenged in the 1800s by these thinkers called the Enlightenment philosophers or the Enlightenment thinkers, who began to ask questions like, well, where does legitimate authority really come from, right? Where does the power come from? Does it come from God, or does it come from somewhere else? And these thinkers began to, have these thought experiments, and they came with this idea that there are natural rights, that all humans, because we're human, have these basic rights given to us by God, and these rulers have no right to take them away from us. They also said that power from government, legitimacy, and this is important, legitimacy of government comes from not God, but the consent of the people being ruled over. That is, it has power over us. You're in charge because we allow you to be in charge. And this was a direct challenge to the idea of the divine right of king. These ideas naturally led to many revolutions that we studied in Unit 10. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Latin American revolutions, right? And these were showing that old governments could be overthrown, but it removed old authority, but it didn't automatically create stable new systems, right? America creates a new constitutional system, and it kind of works more or less for the last, 250 years we're in right now. But in France, we see a lot of chaos from that. In Haiti, we see instability because of economic pressure put on them by other empires. And in Latin America, we also see other issues with this. So it's not guaranteed these systems are going to work. So these revolutions create opportunity, but also creates instability, right? They were powerful and dangerous. They challenged monarchies. They challenged empires. They challenged the idea that you could just inherit your power or position in society, that you get to have wealth and power because your parents had wealth and power. And these ideas start to spread about rights and having elected representation in government and political legitimacy coming from us, the people, and not from God. It is a complete revolution in how we define legitimate government. But these ideas also create fear, division, and conflict over what should the new system look like. Political change is happening faster than stable institutions could be built for, and so that leads to instability and fear. Social and economic inequalities often also survive this even when the government's changed, right? Poor people were still poor. Rich people were still rich, and the wealthy were using their power to control those lower down on the social hierarchy. It didn't get rid of the whole system, it just created a new one with different justifications for its legitimacy. Then in Unit 11, we saw industrialization changing the entire game, right? Transforms power. Industrialization increased production of different resources people needed, and it strengthened governments by giving them a lot more stuff they could use, both to make lives better for their people, but also to create wealth for a small select group, but also weapons for war. It created stronger incentives for imperialism because, in order to feed these factories, you needed large amounts of natural raw materials, and you could pay other countries from that, but why pay for it when you could just take those countries over and then take their resources from them? You also need people to buy your stuff, and so it's just more convenient to own and control the places where the materials come from and the markets you sell to. This was the age of imperialism in the 1800s. Now, transportation and communication at this time were also being improved because of industrialization and the steam engine, which we looked at in Unit 11. This made it easier to move goods, like things to products to sell, but it also made it easier to move armies for conquest, and it also made it easier for information and knowledge to spread. And knowledge can be very destabilizing in areas. The industrial technology also made warfare larger and much, much more destructive, as we saw first in the Napoleonic Wars, and then in the Scramble for Africa, and then finally in World War I and World War II, where we ended this class. We also saw that in Unit 11, modern instabilities were emerging that would eventually lead to the causes of World War I, not just industrialization, but nationalism, which began to really emerge as a proto-nationalist thing in the Hundred Years' War between England and France. This idea that people who have a shared culture, language, history, they should have control over their own government. That's a nationalist identity, an extreme pride in your own culture. These ideas continue to grow. We saw them expand and push back against Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars, and those ideas continue to form the modern states of Italy and modern Germany, right? And this is this idea that you should be really, really super proud and that your nation is better than any other nation out there, and you need to prove it through warfare. Alliances are also really being formed. At the Congress of Vienna, alliances were kind of formed to stop another rise of another Napoleon. But it also made it possible that a local crisis in one area could become a much, much, much larger crisis, because if it's a fight between two people or two groups or two nations, alliances are going to bring all those other nations into it and expand this war. And these forces of nationalism, alliances, imperialism, all this leads to the weakening of once powerful empires like the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, or the Habsburg Empire in the East, and the Ottoman Empire. So these weaknesses start to be exposed by this, as these empires are made up of many different nationalities. Industrial war is also taking off, making conflict more deadly with the invention of the machine gun, for instance. And also planes are starting to become a thing at this time. The Treaty of Versailles ends World War I, but it leaves a lot of people very bitter about how that war ended, feeling a lot of countries felt that they kind of got screwed over. Italy, Germany, Japan, they all felt they got the short end of the stick here, and this leads to rising tensions, right? The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany for the war, unfairly, many would say, but didn't solve the problems that led to the war in the first place. This finally leads us to the rise of fascism, as there's a collapse of limits on power. People begin to turn their back on the ideas of the Enlightenment, right? Fascism gained support because people were in real crisis. They wanted order, they wanted strength, they wanted simple answers. And fascist leaders used ideas like nationalism, you should be proud, you are better than everyone else, propaganda to shape how people think, and scapegoating to blame some, other nefarious force in order to get people to follow their ideas. Now, fascists, they reject the idea that governments should be limited in power. They believe that governments should be all-powerful to achieve their goals for the sake of the nation. And that means individual rights don't matter because they just get in the way of the government being able to achieve its goals for the nation, to get rid of the other that they're scapegoating. These fascist movements will gain support by promising unity and stability among the people who are afraid and feeling weak and feeling in crisis. So in reality, though, fascism depends, in order to have strength, depends on repression, fear and violence, not just among them they're scapegoating, but among their own populations. So the biggest patterns to remember in this class, right? What ideas should you connect to this whole semester? One, legitimacy matters more than force alone, right? You can force people to follow you through violence, but eventually those people are going to rise up against you if they don't feel like you deserve to be in charge. Two, systems can look strong from the outside and look strong for a while, but still have these vulnerabilities baked into them that when a crisis hits can be exploited. A crisis will reveal that deeper weakness. And this is important. All societies, all systems they're used to justify the legitimacy of a government, every single one, even democracy, has structural vulnerabilities in them that can be exploited during a time of crisis. Right? The Weimar Republic in Germany was a democracy and is a great example of this. There was a weakness built into that democracy that was then exploited during the Great Depression that led to people turning to fascists. Now, religion, law, nationalism, ideology, they can all be used to justify why someone gets to be in charge of you. But economic hardship, so when people can't afford to put food on the table, that often becomes a source of political instability. In short, I say it over and over again, right? If people's bellies are empty, that is economic hardship. They're hungry, and then they'll start to notice what's going on, and that can be used to create political instability by people who want to challenge whatever system is in place to justify why someone is in charge. We also saw throughout this semester technology strengthening states, as we saw with, say, machine guns and industrialization, but it also creates increased destruction at the same time, right? The printing press strengthens with knowledge, but also it destabilizes old systems. The machine gun and industrialization strengthens imperial governments, but also leads to World War I and World War II. And then at the end, we left this class talking about the beginnings of the Cold War and the nuclear age, right? These systems that we've been talking about, these problems and structural vulnerabilities, these themes, don't just stop at the end of World War II. They continue after that, even in the period we left off on with the Cold War. And if you study these systems, you can even apply them to the world we live in today, so that you can see why studying history is useful for understanding the modern world. Okay, some more practical stuff. How to be ready for the writing part of this exam. What you should be prepared to do. First, you need to be able to identify a source of legitimacy from the semester. So that is, be able to identify, describe, explain how governments justified their power over other people, right? How they justified their authority. If you don't understand words like legitimacy and authority, you're going to want to ask about that. You need to be able to explain how that legitimacy and how that justifying that authority was challenged, weakened, or exposed as unstable. So what caused that weakening? What revealed that weakness in the system? And you need to be able to use evidence not just from one unit, but from multiple units, right? So if you're using religion as your source of legitimacy, right, you just don't want to use one example when it comes to like the Aztec or, say, the Holy Roman Empire. You're going to want to use multiple examples from multiple units to show that this wasn't a one-off thing. This is a pattern. And you'd be able to compare different ways governments claimed legitimacy. So that's what you should be prepared to do for the writing prompts. That's what the writing prompts are going to be about. If you have questions about what these words mean, you're going to want to ask. So here's a list of some of the sources of legitimacy that you should be able to be prepared to write about. You're not going to need to be able to write about all of these in order to do very, very well and get a perfect score on the written portion of this test, but all of these things do show up in one way or another on the multiple choice questions as well. So they're all good to know about, right? Divine approval / sacred kingship means the same thing. We usually use divine approval, not sacred kingship as a terminology in this class, but essentially just saying your power comes from connection to or relation to the gods. Religious authority, right? You're in charge of how, people believe what people believe about God or the gods, and that gives you your power. Personal loyalty, so feudalism, law and royal justice, the divine right of kings, which is a little different from divine approval, representative government, consent of the governed, nationalism, ideology. All these things are going to show up on the multiple choice section of the test, but you're going to want to be able to write about some of these on the written portion of the test. Final advice for you. How should you prepare? Review the semester as a story, not just isolated facts, right? Study examples of how governments gained and lost legitimacy throughout history in this course. Know how a crisis exposed structural vulnerabilities built into these systems. Be able to review your map locations, right? There's a whole Quizlet about the map locations that may show up on this test. Make sure you're studying that. And be able to practice explaining why systems become unstable. Not just what happened, but why it happened. That's important. And as we end here, no, I'm not going to make you do this again. I told you with the take-home notes, that was going to be your last time to do it. I'm not going to make you do this here. I'm recording this on April Fool's Day, so I thought it'd be pretty funny to do a quick last April Fool's. Anyways, good luck on the exam, and I'll see you on the other side. And as I like to say, goodbye forever.